Alex Ebert, how you doing today, sir?
Hey, you know what I'm doing right now?
What are you doing right now?
I am I am going on rev.com and retrieving transcribed files from the net sessions, because this is part of how I'm lazily writing my excess and absence book.
Oh, I was gonna. Oh, that's magnificent. Oh, that's so great. That I don't think that's lazily. I think that's smart. In different things. Tyler Murphy, good to see you, sir. How are you feeling about the book? How are things coming together for you, Mr. Ebert?
I don't know. I know that I'm just gonna throw enough spaghetti into the bowl and then wait until I feel like, okay, I think I've spewed enough of it to start calling it. I have quite a lot, but in a lot of ways, it's like, I don't know. The whole thing where you just keep saying the same thing over and over again, but in different ways, and that's basically what philosophy is like. Zizek has a bit about that. He's like, a philosopher is basically just putting out book after book, saying the same thing in different ways. Anyhow, so I feel some of the rub of that redundancy. It's a little strange. By the way, I used your Piper, who's the guy?
Yeah, Joseph Piper, the leisure cat.
Yeah, I had to bring him up recently because I just had to, because of the suboptimal thing, and Bard suggested this thing, Leap, for a protopian future attentionalist and to inspire people. L was like, I can't remember what he had for L. It was like fucking something anyway, and then he had E for some other bullshit. And anyway, I was like, well, instead of L, the L should be really like leisure. Oh, I know what the next one was. E was enculturation. Like, the thing that actually enculturates, like is, what I would call suboptimal, what Piper would call leisure. As opposed to this, like, we really need to inspire people to go and create culture. It's like, well, actually, culture is created by taking some time and not going, and being sort of like suboptimal, because as soon as you begin to optimize, you actually deculturalize. So anyway, I got to bring up Piper, picked a peck of pickled pepper, and that was fun to remember that.
Well, it's fascinating. I really appreciate what you're saying. I've been thinking a lot, there are all these different words, and a few things. Sometimes it's interesting because there are some days where you're like, wow, am I just repeating the same point forever? But then it also feels like there's a value add in that, but it's sometimes hard to put your finger on what the value add is. It's almost like coming at the same, it's like looking at a diamond from different sides. Okay, it stays a diamond, but looking at it from different angles actually changes your experience of it, your phenomenology, what the diamond is to you, and actually different ways of wording things, or like different angles of seeing it. And it's almost like if you don't see it from those different angles, you're losing something. Like there actually really is something missing that matters. It also kind of makes me think maybe there's a way in which philosophical reasoning is kind of like, I don't want to reduce it to this, but you know how like the language models search for all the patterns across the internet and then it brings forth a pattern. It's almost like as a philosopher, you have to create your own database so that there are then patterns you can find when you move to the speculative reasoning, right? So you have to do the repetitive precisely because otherwise you wouldn't be able to locate patterns kind of in the way that you're talking about. And then the other thing I was talking about, because it's, some like there seems like you have daydreaming, you have leisure, you have boredom, you have indifference. What's so interesting is one of the reasons also too philosophers may find themselves saying similar things is because they're looking for very subtle differences. Like what's the difference between boredom and leisure? You've said before that without boredom, we can't have these threshold moments. And that's exactly right. But in some contexts, boredom is like the inability to have that threshold, because it's actually like the opposite of the capitalist system to inspire you to go into consuming, right? Like boredom in that sense, like Patricia Spax talks about coming up in the 18th century, seems different from the leisure that Piper is talking about. And yet at the same time, they seem the same. That's what's so weird, right? There's like difference, but also sameness. And it's almost like the philosopher, in looking for these subtle differences, sometimes miss the difference. So they repeat the same thing when they talk about boredom as leisure. Then they come back around and they're like, well, wait, maybe there is a difference there. Then they come back around. Then they come back around. And if I'm freezing, I'm sorry, my internet can suck sometimes. So it's like boredom and leisure seem to have a difference and yet not at the same time. So you find yourself almost repeating because you're trying to locate that difference. And then you're like, well, maybe there isn't a difference. And so you repeat it. And it's like, okay, no, maybe there is. Well, maybe in some contexts it is. And it's almost like that tendency of repetition is just basically the inevitable excess of the effort to find the nuanced difference. I'm talking live. I'd be curious how you respond to that, Mr. Ebert.
Yeah, I think that the repetition, it really is interesting, especially at being like having my philosophy hat on for like almost 3 solid years now, and doing podcasts and writing and having a book on my, it's even the Cool book. When I was writing the book about Cool, I noticed as I started going through it, and it's a good 300 pages, I started just noticing like, oh my God, this is all the same thing. I'm saying the same thing chapter after chapter. I'm just repeating myself. But I'm repeating myself in different contexts and so on. But I know that that's annoyed me with other books that I've read. I've been like, okay, you're literally filling a book. And my perspective was like, this is like some capitalist hoodwinking, right? You could say this in like a page, and instead you're dragging it out over the course of a bazillion pages in order to, and yet, so there's a very fine line between, it's almost like I like the Hegel model. Whereas, like if we were to compare Hegel and Zizek, like the Hegel model being, I don't feel like he's saying the same thing over and over again. In some ways, because you don't know what he's saying ever. You know what I mean? So you never actually are like, oh, this is the same thing he said earlier, because you don't even know what the same thing was that he said earlier. So the whole time you're continually figuring it out, and every time you're figuring it out, you're actually figuring it out more and more clarity and more clarity, and then you're like, oh, this is actually this is revealing the thing from previous. Or the thing previous is now revealing the thing here. So they're related and they're saying the same thing, but actually one is revealing the other. And so it actually feels like a progression. Whereas when you lay it out, just like, everything is saturation, and then everything, and then I just keep repeating that and I keep giving you instances, and God forbid I give you like actual instance. Like Carol was one of my clients, and she was experiencing a difficult time with her, and do that whole thing, which I really can't stand. So yeah, and then there's the Zizek thing, which is another way to approach it, which he's saying the same thing over and over again, but he does a subterfuge of tons of pop analysis to always keep things fresh, and he's always introducing like some new fucking Barbie essay or something. And so you kind of take your eye off the ball that way. But it's difficult to walk that line and not feel like you're constantly repeating yourself. And then on the other hand, it's a trap to never repeat yourself and just always be going from, oh, I'm going to analyze this guy. I'm curious how you feel about this guy. I don't read your stuff in depth enough to know what your take is on this, but I do know that you are going from one philosopher, one sort of form of thought, one school of thought to the next, and you tie them together. And I see you doing that. But where do you feel like your voice is in that, and where does your voice repeat itself in that sort of classically philosophical way, or are you viewing yourself more at the moment as in a a sort of consumptive phase where you're mastering these pools before you present what it is that you would be repeating ad nauseum?
That's an excellent question. And I think you're pointing at something really important. So for example, there are definitely a lot of filler crap repeat books. You know, I tell all the time that the majority, this is horrible to say, but the majority of nonfiction New York Times bestsellers, you can read the intro, you can read the conclusion, and then the middle case studies, and then read the rest of it extremely fast, because that is the book, basically. They're all about between 200 and 250 pages, because that's what they have found following the market is optimal. And what they do is the case is you can literally read intro, conclusion, and the middle case study, because that's usually the joint point, and the rest are just kind of case studies as evidence for it. They all have this structure, right? But it's like in Hegel, as you know, a return is never a return, right? The return is always an RE in parentheses. Well, there seems to be a repetitive that is this problematic filler repetitive, but then there's another repetitive with the RE in parentheses, which is the repetition that somehow gains something that you need the repetition to occur. So there's a bothness here where, like, if the idea that defines your book on coolness shows up nowhere else, isn't that kind of a problem? Like, wouldn't that suggest there's probably nothing there? Like, the fact that there's some kind of pattern or something that shows up a bit in freak theory, not in the exact same way, but in some way it's there. It shows up in the coolness. It comes up with the excess and absence. Well, that repetition is actually evidence that there's substance, right? But then in another way, the repetition you see in these filler books is evidence that there's not substance. So it's funny because repetition with the RE in parentheses is exactly what you would hope there would be, because if it wasn't there, then there's a good chance that what you're talking about doesn't have substance to it, or it's more at risk. But then there's also the repetition that is the filler. And actually, I think the good philosopher actually has that nervousness, because that makes the act of writing kind of courageous, right? Like, the very fact that there's kind of a fear that you might be repeating actually then has to be faced so that you can do the repeating with the RE in parentheses. So there's two responses. Like, one of the reasons people can just jump from new thing to new thing to new thing is because then they know they're not repeating. Oh, good. I'm always original. But you see, that originality is a kind of spurious originality, which then, funny enough, you could just like not have any substance, right? But then there's also the, oh crap, I know this was a good idea, so let me have 500 books about that good idea because I know that was a good idea. And that's kind of a spurious repetition. But there's some sort of repetition here with the RE in parentheses, just to use that because I've talked about Hegel's return with the RE in parentheses, that then actually is precisely the method that suggests substance. Now, there's the risk that you're crazy, but basically, you know, that it's a conspiracy and you're just seeing the number 32 everywhere in that Jim Carrey movie or whatever. But that is a necessary risk that you have to have the courage to face to say something that has some substance to it, right? And so that's like, and it's kind of nerve-wracking, but it's actually a necessary part. And that's also why the act of writing philosophy can have some personal and emotional training in it, precisely because you're saying, no, I'm not crazy. There is something to this. Let me do it again. Okay, no, it shows up in coolness. Oh, no, it shows up in excess and absence. It's there. It's not because I'm seeing it everywhere, because I'm looking at this thing in its particularity, and a formal structure keeps emerging, not because I'm imposing it, but because if you look at the thing clearly, this thing keeps coming up, right? I've talked about that, as you know, like on Nietzsche as a core thinker. I think Ivan Illich, it's a phenomenological philosophical method where you're like, I'm going to look really close at things, and if there is some overarching form between them, it will come out from the deep analysis of the thing on its own terms, not trying to impose an idea on it. But of course, you have to run the nervousness that maybe I'm just saying that. Maybe I'm just saying that and I really am imposing it. But that right there is the courage. That right there is the kind of courage thing. I'll pause there. I'd be curious what you think, and then I'll talk about my own writing stuff. You're muted, my friend.
And also, it's the difficulty that I have, or the thing that I'm aware of, is you can study systems or study particularities and see the emergence of a sort of foundational structural philosophy. And then in your giddiness at having discovered this foundational generality in all the particularities, run around giving examples of the particulars and overlaying the philosophy over it so that everyone sees. And you're like, see, this is the thing I was talking about, and this is too, and so is this. But you don't allow the reader to experience that development for themselves, because and thereby their phenomenological experience of your declaration will be that you're simply overlaying your own point of view over particularities, and that you have some kind of confirmation bias. And so how do you write in such a way that invites them into the particularity, such that the particularity and the way that you lay it out reveals it to them without you really, it's like the leading a horse to water thing. And that's difficult. It's difficult on a number of levels. It's almost difficult on an ethical level, where it's like, am I really going to waste my time? Like, I'm basically manipulating these people to water when I could just tell them what it is. And so there's a rhetorical issue here where we have to sort of manipulate people through rhetoric to bring them into the realization that, it's like Inception. And so there's something inherently deceptive about the truth. There's something inherently deceptive about revealing truth to someone else. You cannot simply tell them what is the truth, or they won't believe it. So instead, you have to deceive them and sort of Socrates it. That's why the whole Socratic method is supposedly so powerful, but also why Socrates seems like such an asshole, because he's just constantly like pretending to be dumb and being like, I don't know, what do you think? No, really, I know nothing. And then people literally take that literally and are like, no, Socrates really didn't know anything. He was a very humble man. No, bullshit. He knew everything. He was just playing and lying in order to get people to see the truth. And I suppose that it's something that must be done.
I really love what you were saying, and Javier, good to see you. One of the great problems with the story of the allegory of the cave is, one, as you know, we never learn how you leave the cave if you're not dragged out. But the truth of the matter is, in the real world, it's not a philosopher who comes and drags you out. It's the shadows that lead you out. Like the pictures of the shadow actually are what kind of point you out. That's like, and I tried to write a lot on when Socrates, Plato banishes the poet and different things. There's like a lot there, because actually the method that leads people into truth very much has a lot to do with actually the structure of good fiction. Now, I just said a lot there, but what was very influential, because we'll get in my own method, as you asked about, there's a short story writer who I think is extremely good named Flannery O'Connor. She was a Southern writer, and she wrote an essay. She wrote a number of essays on how to do fiction, and she's constantly fighting against people who want happy stories. She's like, no, she's constantly, the main thing I'll focus on, though, is in her essay, The Catholic and the Protestant South. She's talking about the tendency of writers to build symbols because they want to make sure their story has meaning. Like, they're nervous that it will, that the story won't have any kind of deeper architecture, that people will just think it's meaningless. So what they do is they create symbols. And she's like, that's the exact wrong thing you do in a story. And, as a Catholic, she kind of believed that if God made the world, everything is sacramental and has meaning. So if you just describe a hat, then it will have meaning. Like, if you try to make the symbol, if you try to make the hat a symbol, then it doesn't have meaning, actually. Your job as a story writer is to describe the actual world in its own terms without any intention of pouring additional meaning onto it. And if you do that properly, then the meaning will come out, right? And so she goes through like all of these writers who are in the business of symbol making, or making their story have a moral, or making their story kind of force some of intention. And that it's kind of like, no, that's not how you do it. And the funny thing is, basically she suggests a good story that actually is deeply meaningful will suggest it has no meaning beyond the story. So it's a kind of lie, just like you were saying, right? Like, if you just accurately describe, and the thing is, he's like, if you force a meaning upon the reader, then they hate you. They're like, oh, this is stupid. Like, oh, it's a moral tale. I couldn't care less. In the same way, like you were saying, if you try to like just tell people, hey, man, there's this like formal structure everywhere. They're like, okay, conspiracy boy. I see the trumpet in the Pidgeon novel everywhere. And so she's going through and like trying to describe that if you successfully do a story, now, of course, what is a story and all of these different things, then that is the only way to have the correct effect of a story. And if you try to skip that because you want to make sure a meaning gets across, you're going to get neither, actually. You're going to lose both. So then the question becomes, for me, that was really influential because it begged the question for me, and Michelle and I did so much in fiction, but it also then begged the question for me, what is the right way then to do philosophy that doesn't force meaning, right? Well, it seems really weird with philosophy because isn't the whole point of philosophy a kind of meaning? Like, at least with a story, you can say, okay, well, it's like for the story and the emotion and the experience and different things. But what is the correct method of philosophy to not make the same mistake that you see in fiction? And yet it seems easier to make that mistake precisely because it is so focused on, say, foundational forms or notions or ideas. And this is where I started kind of looking at like phenomena. I'd be curious how you respond to that, just your thoughts first.
Well, my immediate thought is that it immediately brings me back in terms of story and narrative to the idea of montage, and which is basically just the idea of relational imagery, relational symbology, and that meaning is not within the item, the object that is being symbolized, but it is within the space between one item and its constellations. The surrounding constellation of items, and that we derive meaning anyway from the absence between items of symbol. And so almost fundamentally, to begin with, meaning occurs in the in-between, the in-betweening, and we've talked about this a lot. And it's within that absence between objects that we derive meaning in so many ways. The author is not the meaning maker, the audience is. And even if the author is being like, this is what this means, within that constellation of words and declarations, and between those words and the constellations that they refer to and the proclaimer of those words, we derive the meaning that this meaning is being forced on us. And how did we figure that out? Well, we we triangulated all those words with the person speaking, and we're like, no, it's not meaningful. But I think the point being, we're always aware that the things that we are laying out in front of people, the words, the rhetoric, the symbols, the ideas, are in and of themselves inherently non-meaningful. They are orienting objects, which through their relations and through the negativity which facilitates their relations. So the items are the positivity and the negativity is the space in between them. And it's within that negativity that the listener or the viewer or the consumer draws out the meaning themselves, right? And that's just the way that meaning works. You know, we construe, we construct, and it's within the constellation, within the negativity of the constellations. And so then we think about our philosophy, and we keep that in mind, and we realize we don't actually need to fill every space. In fact, filling every intellectual space to try and make sure that we have every single fucking angle, and you know, could potentially we could box ourselves out of our own philosophy because we've over described it, and we've left no room for it to breathe, for it to have life. And what I mean by that really is for it to have no for the listener, the reader, to be involved themselves. But yeah, it's something to keep in mind, because when we think about storytelling, and I just, you know, Eisenstein's montage theory, which is just, you know, woman smiling, shot of a bird, woman frowning. 3 totally separate, almost orthogonal items, and yet we can put the story together. How do we do that? You know, we insert ourselves in between, and we draw a meaning by create a relation between the items. So if we take that same approach with philosophy, with our philosophies, you know, I don't know what that entails exactly or what that ends up looking like, but it's certainly something to keep in mind that we look at our philosophies and our communications generally, but our philosophies, because philosophy is so easy to not think of as fiction and to think that we have to be like that, 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 that. But if we can keep it in mind, and chapter by chapter or paragraph by paragraph or image by image, be aware of the gaps, such that the gaps we hope will produce the story of the truth of the message, as opposed to delivering the truth of the message as an object. Because if we deliver the truth of the message as an object, which says this is the truth, it's likely that people won't be able to get inside the object and will instead treat it as an object that is involved in a constellation of other objects, including the author and their ego. And somehow the whole truth within that object will be contained and constrained and unloosed upon the world. So, yeah, it's interesting.
I think everything you said is excellent. I'm going to give it to Tyler Murphy. So a few things. So Flannery O'Connor will say that the point of fiction is mystery. Now, mystery is important because mystery is a weird I am here, but not here at the same time space. Like it's the great I'm not. Like mystery, a way I've thought about it is when you read a book and there's a movie playing in your head, you know, like you're reading Lord of the Rings and you're in the Shire. Where are you? Where are you exactly? You're between being in the bathtub as an 8-year-old with a big blanket reading the book and then being in the scene, right? You're in a between space. Books work by a between space. They create a place you are and not at the same time. And like mystery is where suddenly, like if it's that moment of in deep, profound phenomenology where you say, oh my gosh, that's a bookcase. I know you've made the example of a sunset. The sunset suddenly is effused with something beyond just the facticity of the sunset, and yet it's not dualistic. That's weird. So what is it? It's a kind of between space that emerges. For Flannery O'Connor, he says a few things. He's like, one, if anyone reads my stories and knows I'm a Catholic, I suck. You should never know the ideology. The reader should be like, is she a Catholic? Because this is some violent stuff right here, baby. And it's like, well, what is the reader now? They're in a between space, right? They're between, isn't she a Catholic? But this isn't Catholicism. What's going on, right? Well, that's what you're supposed to do. The great writers put you in a kind of between space. Like, let's take her story, Greenleaf. She had a big theory that often grace had to manifest through violence because people were so stuck up on their ways, right? She has this image of a bull impaling someone. Well, you're now in a between space because you thought you knew what grace was, but what is grace if it can be violent to wake people up? You're kind of trapped now between your idea of what you thought grace was, what you're now seeing it, you're in a between space, and that's why the story can create meaning for you. It doesn't tell you what grace is, but it suggests to you, hey, what if the way that you actually wake people up out of their own trouble is an act of violence? You know, like A Good Man is Hard to Find. A lot of her stories, Elaine Schroeder first and so on. So it places you in a between space and you don't know where to sit because this is a take on Catholicism I've never heard before. This is a take on grace I've never heard before. And it's meaningful precisely because you're between ideas before you had a set notion about that now you've lost. So it's created a between space for you. And I think basically the way I've thought about it, and then I'll give it to Tyler Murphy, and then this will also get into the methodology that you asked me at the beginning. I've always been quite taken by the image that Karl Barth in a debate with Aquinas and Austin Farrer and all these people, he said that he talked about the crater of the meteor. And basically philosophy should always be the crater and never the meteor. Good art is the crater of the meteor, but not the meteor. So you draw and describe the crater, but not the meteor. But that runs the risk of the audience not seeing the shape and knowing it's a meteor, right? But that is the necessary courage that is required to do philosophy and to do art. You're always making the crater. So what is a philosophy that's trying to show the crater and not the meteor? Now, you can show the crater so well that it could, the only thing it possibly could be for a meteor. You let the audience say that, though. You don't say that. You just do such an effing good job of drawing the crater, of describing the crater, that the audience then on their own takes the final step of going, well, if I followed that correctly, that's a meteor. I didn't say it. You said it. You said it, audience. I didn't say it. You said it, right? That is the key. And Flannery O'Connor, and I'm thinking Walker Percy and different people, that to me was always a really big deal. Because then it meant the job of philosophy is to make the crater, not the meteor. The job of good fiction is to draw the crater, not the meteor. And there's a certain vulnerability. There's a certain scariness in that, because what if they don't get it's a meteor? But that is why you need to do it. Because if you don't face that fear, then it becomes propaganda, basically. Like, one of the things that turns the reason Flannery O'Connor is not Catholic propaganda is because she drew the crater. She didn't draw the meteor. She didn't say, become a Catholic. She's like, here's a crater. Now you decide, you go from there. And that's why it becomes art, not propaganda. So there's something, and then the question is, what is and then I'll give it to Tyler here. How do you do fiction? How do you tell a story to draw a crater, not a meteor? And likewise, how do you do philosophy to show a crater and not the meteor? Well, I think that gets into a bit of the repetition, because you kind of have to walk around the crater a bunch of times to kind of outline it, right? And that seems to be like the repetition with the RE in parentheses versus the repetition that's filler, right? It's almost like the repetition that's filler is when you keep saying over and over again, that's a meteor, that's a meteor, that's a meteor, that's a meteor. Where the repetition that's good with the RE in parentheses is where you keep walking around the outline of the crater. Never saying it's a meteor, but walking around it again, walking around it again, walking around it in a different way. Maybe the first time you walked around the top, then you walk up and down. But it's always on the crater from different angles, but you're gradually describing the crater, never directly pointing at the meteor. And so there's something about, and that's one of the reasons I then got into phenomenology, because it seemed like that seemed to be a unique method to help with that. Now, it depends on what we mean by phenomenology, but there are things there. Now, that all in mind, I'll then get into what you asked on my own method of reading Simone Weil and Hegel and how that all ties together. And it gets into a bit of Schopenhauer and some of the Austin Ferris stuff, but I'll give it to Tyler Murphy. This is a fascinating discussion, by the way. I think about this quite a lot because this kind of methodology, the tension between what's the philosopher doing, not the repetition, I think it's a really critical thing. But Tyler Murphy, please.
It's been great listening to you guys, and the indirect communication kind of comes up. I think it was maybe Kierkegaard who talked somewhat about how do we become artists of indirect communication. But some of what Mr. Ebert was saying caused me to think about some of my favorite artists and often the way that I try to paint. But so there's this. I went over to my bookshelf real quick and I grabbed this book this is a guy named Ned Jacob. He's maybe 80 now, 80 something. And just one of the best draftsmen, in my opinion, kind of the 1950s to 2000. And I got to study with him a few times. He was one of these guys who every story ended with, most stories anyways that he told ended with, and you know what? The guy never talked to me after that. I don't know why. So he was a real character. And most people, when I bring him up, they say, I say, do you love him or hate him? And a lot of people hate this guy. but anyways, I learned a ton from this guy, and the way that he would draw, where he's just suggesting a lot and that space in between. And I remember him saying, looking at a lot of portraiture or landscape painting that is absolutely showing every little detail. He says, yeah, you painted everything except the life. And so anyways, I kind of think about that. Caricature also is another, caricature is what got me interested in painting to begin with. I remember when I was probably 5 or 6, my parents had come back from Las Vegas and they had 2 caricatures done of them. And I was so fascinated by how this cartoon could represent them and almost be more them than a photograph would be of them. So anyways, I just wanted to kind of throw that into the conversation.
I cannot overstate my appreciation of that statement. Like, you know, I think it's like Walter Benjamin, and I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. Like, he was like, the photograph doesn't have aura. And that actually there is something about the painted portrait that captures something the photograph doesn't, precisely because it's too exact, right? Like, this is what's weird. So in computer science, as you know, I've mentioned before, there's this tension that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Like, if you have a model that's so perfect, it actually becomes useless. And why do you even need a perfect model? Because why not just have the thing, right? Like, a perfect map is useless, because then it's just the territory and it's also unreadable, right? So a map is useful because it is wrong, because it is missing things. And a good map is one that isn't perfect. Well, that's weird as heck, because what are we as human beings judging then? When we say that's a good map, on what? Like, when you say this portrait captures something the photograph doesn't, what are you judging? Like, what is this thing that you are judging? I think you're completely correct. There's something about the portrait that captures an aura that the photograph doesn't. What are you judging? So here's the thing. Good art puts the audience in a place of judging something they know is there, but don't know how they know it's there. That's the between space. So a good story is like, I know there was meaning here, and I can't put it into words. And because I can't put it into words, the meaning is there. The inability to put it into words means you can't make the territory into the map, that there's thus a break, a between space that then creates the meaning, right? And so good philosophy does that. Good art does that. And I think what's weird, the trick here, and then I'll give it to Mr. Ebert, is you somehow make the meteor more alive by never describing it and only describing the crater. This is the bizarre thing about human beings. The meteor is more alive to us in a work that only describes the crater than a work that describes the meteor and keeps repeating it over and over again. There is something about the crater that is more alive than the direct description of the meteor, if I keep using that metaphor over and over again, which of course suggests lack, because lack is a present absence. It's not nothing. There is something about great work that points beyond itself, but only points beyond itself because it is in relation to the audience. And the work sets itself up. Well, good work has to trust the audience too, right? Like, it has to say, I'm going to intentionally leave something out, and I'm going to trust the audience will then follow what is left out, because I left it out so intentionally, so well, that it does successfully point, and I'm going to trust. Well, that's courage then. You have to have courage to have that trust. You then have to have the skill to know how to create the effect of pointing beyond itself, which is really weird, because how do you point toward a meteor from the crater? There is a way to do it. It's very skillful, but what is that skill? And that's the skill the philosopher has to have. And that's also, for me, and I'll give it to Mr. Ebert, when Derrida basically was like, philosophy of presence is over, you can't have that because of the signifier-signified gap. That to me wasn't the end of, say, phenomenology and metaphysics, though for Derrida, he was suggesting it. That meant the quality of these things had to shift from trying to like bring the meteor into presence to rather drawing the crater to point at the meteor. That is what changed. If you cannot have presence in the way the deconstructionists are getting at, well, then we're not going to focus on the meteor. We're going to focus on the frickin' crater. And good fiction will do the same thing. And actually, that creates that meaningful effect. I'd be curious what you think of that. Mr. Ebert, please.
I wish I was more well-read on Derrida, but let me show you a picture that I'm just staring at. I love this painting, and you guys are reminding me of it. How do I fucking turn this thing around? Can I? Oh, here we go. Here we are. This painting makes me think about the face more than any painting with a face. And I just love, I just love the absence of that face. And it's a good example, I think, of everything you're saying, right? Both of you guys. Of course, with drawing, and painting, the use of negative space, the things you're leaving out, all the advances of impressionism, really any painting, with the exception of like, you know, photorealistic stuff, which is kind of disinteresting to me because it's like, well, that's just what I see. I mean, the only thing that's impressive about that is the technique of the artist. And I suppose one can be like, whoa, they're amazing, but the painting's not amazing. Their skill is amazing. And I don't know if that means the art is amazing or just the skill of the artist. But I'm much more interested in the things where there's a lack. I was just thinking about Wes Anderson movies, and there's so much missing. It's like information theory, right? You have to have constraints in order for a certain piece of information come. You have to suppress all information so that you can grasp some information. Otherwise, you'll just have a static. Like, we understand this. I say this every single fucking week. This is an example, by the way, of my repetition, and I'm self-conscious of my repetition because I don't want to bore you guys. But the constraints, let's just say, of Wes Anderson, they're not obvious, but you see what's missing. The reason he's able to achieve the clean lines in every shot is because the room has almost nothing in it. There will be a single room with wood floors, a old radio, a askew painting, and let's say a nightstand and a window with a silver moon, a sliver of a moon, improbably positioned, and a guy in really nice old pajamas and well-appointed slippers and a smoking pipe. And that's it. And he's speaking to the camera, and it's compelling and it's symmetrical. But what's missing is the dirt and lint and all the regular shit that we would normally see, as well as, you know, all sorts of things like, you know, I mean, shit, just looking around, look at this fucking place, right? I mean, that's a tableau. So anyway, you you end up, though, nevertheless communicating. Like, I don't know why I'm sticking with Wes Anderson right now. I know he's like a very pop and it's not a very special thing to bring up, but every time I see a Wes Anderson thing, even if I don't like it or it's not as good as fucking, you know, Rushmore Tenenbaums, which nothing else he's done is as good as those. Nevertheless, every time I see one of his things, I'm left with a feeling that I can't describe. And it's not because of what is present, it's because of what is absent. And what he has taken away to reveal leaves me in this strange place where I know what I'm seeing is not reality. And yet I know what I'm seeing is a reality, is an idealized version of a reality that I myself like dreamed when I was a kid. Like, oh, that's reality. That's what a smoking jacket would feel like. That's what walking down a hall would feel like. That's what having kids would feel like. And yet it's not at all what having kids would feel like. It's a caricature, right? So, and yet the caricature is somehow more, it's like the Baudrillard simulacra issue, where the more you Xerox a copy of the tree, the more like a tree it becomes, until it's more of a tree than the tree. And yet it's missing all of the nuance of the tree. And so I guess where this is leading me is coming maybe to Lacan, or to the boiling down, which is essentially the removal, the reduction. The reduction of an idea is a filtering out. You know, even with information compression, there's information loss. And so whatever you lose, nevertheless, you know, like in a synthomic way, like the meme, the more the meme gets passed, the more information loss. It's like a game of telephone. It starts one way and ends totally garbled in the final ear. There's information loss in repetition. But there's also a consolidation in that repetition, and a quickening, where the more compressed a piece of information, the faster it goes. And yet the more information is lost. And yet the more our attention goes to it because of its acquiring increasing gravitational specificity. It's like, that's a clock. These are sunglasses. These ones, not those ones. Those ones are kind of sunglasses, but you know those Ray-Bans, the famous Ray-Bans, the jazz, those are sunglasses. Because we've seen them so often, they've gained this gravitational allure where that's a sunglass, and everything else is sort of like sunglass adjacent, you know. And it's interesting what this relationship between repetition, information loss, consolidation, absence. And I just wonder, with regard to philosophy, in the process of repetition, you know, you become a meme. And we be aware, like, you know, Hegel is the meme of the false meme of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or you know, I don't know. Lacan is the meme of jouissance or something, and Freud is the meme of fucking, you know, the ego or whatever, death drive, and so you have these ideas that have been boiled down, and I guess bringing it back, I'm trying to, because basically I'm starting to contradict myself, which is to say that, again, this comes back to death drive. Everything seems to want to reduce itself, to reduce its nuance, to reduce its frayed expressions, and to consolidate itself into a more inert form. Our minds want to do that. They want to turn riding a bike into second nature, everything, the encounter with the orange into second nature, where everything is just an orange, or sunglasses. And I'm no longer thinking about what the variations on sunglass are. I just see sunglass. And so if we're doing that with our philosophies and we're repeating ourselves, we're sort of self-meming our philosophies. We're turning slowly, concretizing them into a more and more inert, stable, saturated form, where they can then be more easily transmitted from person to person. Oh, Daniel Gardner, he's this guy. Oh, he's the guy who does this thing, right? And ultimately, that's what we're prepping our philosophies for, is for transmission through this process of repetition, which is a process of information loss. Ironically, because it involves more and more information, but it's the same information being repeated from different angles. And so in a lot of ways, and this comes back to something I thought about before, you know, it's like, how do we as philosophers anticipate the consolidation of our philosophy such that when it is transmitted as a consolidated, informationally lost meme, it communicates its positivity in such a way that the constellations of ideas that it conjures in its very presence creates the negativities, the absences, that invite the audience to nevertheless inform themselves of all the nuance that would have been contained in it had it not been consolidated. So that the consolidated meme somehow nevertheless inspires the audience to reconstitute the nuance, almost like freeze-dried food. You know, like that's like what the best philosophy, and the water that we add is just human thought. And all of a sudden it comes back to life. And so instead of putting the burden on the philosopher that all the nuance must be contained within the meme, nevertheless, the meme, I think the philosopher in a lot of ways can be blamed and should be blamed for a meme that does not produce the reconstitution of the nuance of the primal thrust of the philosophy. If it doesn't reconstitute all the nuance, then the philosopher did not take into account the consolidation of their philosophy in anticipation of its consolidation. And I think about this all the time. It's like, how can I express myself in this nuanced 300-page book way, which nevertheless is going, knowing that it's going to be collapsed into a few sentences, and a few core ideas. How can I make those core ideas express themselves in such a way that the absence that it surrounds itself with, vis-a-vis the constellation of items and ideas that it conjures, reconstitutes all the nuance that was in the book in the first place, and inspires people, and doesn't just suddenly it's like Nietzsche's, I don't want to suddenly be used by a Hitler 2.0 as their reference, and be like, wait, you misunderstood. I think we're responsible in a lot of ways for that. We have to putt around corners.
That was excellent. Philosophy must ultimately lead the viewer to a place where they have to make a choice between equally rational options, because that means you're making the creator of the meteor as opposed to the meteor. And let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, so whatever you make, there's going to be information loss. But if you make a crater, that information loss is not of the meteor. So the philosopher is trying to make a crater. What's happened is a lot of philosophers are trying to say, well, we can never get at the meteor, so they take information away from the meteor. No. That's not what you do. You're like, well, let me, instead of taking a photograph of the meteor, I'm going to draw a painting of the meteor. That's better, but the problem is you're still trying to make present the substance, and therefore not leading the audience into a between space where they have to make a choice or experience a meaning. What you should instead do is paint a meteor crater, not take a photograph of a meteor crater. So you paint the meteor crater, and ultimately what that does is, even if information is lost in the crater, the information that is compressed still never allows the viewer or the audience to get away from asking what exactly made the crater. What exactly is being brought into focus by this lack? The choice never goes away. This is the issue. Philosophers must never remove the choice of interpretation or the choice of what it means from the audience. But they also cannot leave so many options of choices available that then ultimately it was a waste of time. I think about it in terms of Wittgenstein's duck bunny. You know how you have that bunny that's both a duck and a bunny based on the way you look at it, just with the drawing, right? The philosopher's goal is to leave the audience with a duck bunny. A bunny and they have to decide if they want to see a bunny or if they want to see a duck. And that means you leave them with a choice. That means you leave them in a between space. And that means you leave them in a place of meaning. If you tell them it's a duck, well, you gave them the meteor. If you say it's a bunny, you gave them the meteor. And if you say, well, bunnies and ducks don't exist, then you gave them nothing. So you have to give them a duck bunny. You have to give them a choice that then ultimately they are left with, but you did a whole lot of work to make that duck bunny so that they can have that choice. You had to do the work to gradually bring them to the place. Like you were saying, you have to do a lot of work to lead them. So the question is the following: what are you leading them to? You are leading them to the duck bunny. You are leading them to the crater of the meteor. And then you say, all right, have fun, and you leave them. No matter how much information is compressed or lost, the choice never goes away. That is what you're trying to keep always uncompressed. Your philosophy is going to be compressed. Your thinking is going to be compressed. Information will be lost. But if you designed it in a way to lead to a choice like we just described, that choice doesn't lose information. Maybe the path to the choice gets compressed. Maybe but there's a difference between the path losing some of the nuance and the ultimate duck bunny picture or the meteor crater, right? That's always still alive. And so you have this question of how to lead. So the other things too is like on this nervousness of repetition. Like you said, oh, I don't want to bore you, Mr. Luber, good to see you. So you have this idea of like, there's a repetition that's boring, but then there's a repetition that gives me confidence that I'm still on the path. Like, oh, the path's still there. Great. Oh, this topic Ebert talks about to come up again. Oh, this must be a path because it keeps coming up. It's leading somewhere. So that's the difference between boredom and leisure. if we use that language here. Leisure is the constant gaining of confidence that this is a path of which is brought out by the repetition of ideas that keep coming up. Therefore, the repeat is in parentheses. So now I'm confident that I'm on a path, not that I'm not going anywhere. That's the repetition that's then comfortable. It's like, oh my gosh, this is leading me somewhere. This is leading me to a duck bunny picture. This is leading me to the crater. But of course, you as the philosopher have to face the nervousness and anxiety that you're boring the person. Precisely, here's the thing. That means you yourself are faced with a choice in the giving of the philosophy, like the choice you're going to lead your audience to. And that's why it has the possibility of leading them to a choice like the duck bunny picture, because you yourself are facing that kind of choice in the creation of the philosophy and the looking for it, right? So the medium is the message, the things are transferred for. So you're trying to bring them to a place of that kind of choice. And because there's a choice is always a what? A between space. All choice is a between space. That's why it's a choice. Like when the montage shows up, there you're in a between space and meaning arises because there's the possibility of you choosing what the connections are. The connections are up to you to choose. But you see, the beauty is the key to the philosopher is it has to be in what I call absolute choice. The picture you lead them to have to equally look like a bunny and equally look like a duck. If you as the philosopher make it look just a little bit more like a duck than a bunny, then you're not actually creating an absolute choice. You have to have genuine authenticity to the equality of the options so that there's a real choice in the meaning, because otherwise it's not a full between space. But that means you have to that's really hard and that requires a lot of technique. But if you do that, it creates the most meaningful effect known to man. It would be Heidegger's clearing, honestly. If you create that equal duck bunny, that's a clearing of knowing for sure what it is, but knowing there is something there that then you choose, that then lets something come forth. So that's what you as the philosopher have to lead people to. And that's focusing all of your technique on the crater. You mentioned Russ Anderson. I agree that Rushmore is very good. He makes me think of James Joyce. In Rushmore, the style came after the story. After Rushmore and a lot of Wes Anderson's, the movie is the style. Likewise, James Joyce's greatest work is The Dead, because the technique was in service of the story, where by the time you get into Finnegan's Wake, the story is the technique. Well, that's not a story. Technique must be in service of story. So this is the issue. The question is the following. What is the meteor crater and what is the meteor? In story, the meteor crater is story. The meaning is the meteor that you never talk about. So you pour all your technique on the story. So everything is about order, right? In the philosophy, what is the philosophy? The philosophy is the path leading to the duck bunny picture. And I really just like saying duck bunny now, is leading you to the absolute choice. And then the absolute choice is outside the philosophy, right? So what ends up happening is if you get that out of order, then you get movies that the style is the main emphasis, and you lose the story, so you have no emotional investment in the work. Like in Rushmore, you're very invested in the character, and the quirkiness is in service of your emotional investment in the character, actually. And I think another example is the guy who did Phantom Thread, No Country for There Will Be Blood. I forget his name. He's another example where his best works are very subtly rooted in a story unfolding through a character, and the style and the technique is in service of that. As opposed, so the philosopher, what you see here is the philosopher has to get things in the right order. They need to, Paul Anderson, that's it, very nice. And they have to get things in the right order. They have to know where to pour their technique. They have to pour it on making the meteor crater. They have to pour it on the path leading to the duck bunny picture. I'm using as many metaphors as I possibly can here, and then I'll give it to Michelle. And then they don't, and knowing that the technique will entropy, the technique will compress, but since all of the technique and information is poured on the frickin' meteor crater, if it compresses, the meteor is not lost. The thing is not lost. The choice is still just as live as it was. The choice never gets any less of a choice. The audience is left with just as much of a choice no matter what at the end of the day if they follow the path. So you must make sure that knowing that your philosophy will inevitably be memed, it will inevitably be paraphrased, it will be inevitably compressed. No matter how much is compressed, it is functioned in a manner that is always pointing further down the path. And when they get to the end of the path, the thing that it was leading to was something beyond the philosophy, therefore it cannot be entropy or compressed, because it's the meteor crater, not the meteor. And that then leaves the audience with the choice of, will they keep going? You've now inspired them. You've now given them something to work on. But getting all of these things in order, getting the sense of what you're supposed to focus on, grasping the inevitable decline and all that different stuff, that's huge. And if you don't think about this when you go to do your philosophy, you can make mistakes. But the way I think about it, and I'll give it to Michelle, and then I'll talk about my own way of writing, because like basically I'm trying to describe Simone Weil alongside someone like Hegel and neurodivergence to then actually not make you an expert on Simone Weil, but to create a between space. That's what I'm trying to do in these books. So like, instead of being like, oh, I'm going to like be a, the way to put it is Austin Farrer said, you need to study study Hume, not to be a Hume scholar, but to be on what Hume was on, to capture the fire, right? And one of the ways you do that is when you start creating, you're using philosophers to create between spaces to try to get that meaning so that the reader can capture the thing that Hume or Hegel or whoever was on, so that they can be on it as well. And then they're now presented a choice on if they're going to pursue that thing they're on. So you're trying to create between spaces, not just to be a Hegel scholar, not just to be a Hume scholar. You want to be a scholar of Hegel so you can be good enough at describing Hegel to then create between spaces between, say, your moment now and Hegel, the topic of coolness and Hegel, the topic of anything and Hegel. And now I am inspired because I am in between space to be on something just like Hegel was. And now I have the resources of Hegel to go into these different things. The funny thing is that to create those between spaces, you have to really know philosophers to create the between spaces. So you're becoming a Hegel scholar precisely not to be a scholar of Hegel. It's the most crazy negation ever, but that's how you do it. You have to become a scholar of a philosopher to know the right way to negate them from the audience so that then they're inspired and dynamic as opposed to stagnant. And this is all the technique that you see kind of in fiction writing. Let me give it to Michelle.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. And honestly, it's been great to hear from everybody too. I think what you're bringing up, Alex Ebert, is really a really hard question, and I think everything you just said really.
Michelle, well, this is an example of lack that then creates longing. And we have to make a choice now on if we wait for Michelle to come back or not. So this is what we want to emulate in our philosophy. Yeah, I literally think about my job in essays is to guide people to a duck bunny picture. Literally, I think about that all the time. How to guide them to seeing something that is a duck bunny that leaves them with a choice that then the work has inspired them to choose about. It's doing that double thing. They're following the path to the duck bunny or the Schrodinger's cat box, whatever language you want to use. It's leading them to a duck bunny picture. It's leading them to a crater of a meteor, making them care about the duck bunny picture, making them inspired to make a choice, and that will then compel them to keep going from that point. As opposed to telling them, oh, it's a duck. Oh, it's a bunny. That's not my job. My job is to lead them to a picture that equally looks like a duck, equally looks like a bunny. Then it's up to them to make the choice. And now they know they're the kind of being of whom can make such choices. And that then leads to a kind of inspiration. Let me give it to you, Mr. Luber. Hey, Mr. Luber, how you doing?
I'm alive. I'm good. Here to stay. Let's hear it.
This is a good question I would have for Luber then. Let's just take the idea of trope, because what trope is basically a narrative component which has been repeated so much across millennia that it's now an expected trope. And yet you can't get away from these tropes when you're telling a story. So the very repetition of the aspect creates this inescapable path, which is not redundant, even though it is redundant, but through its sheer repetition and inescapability, presents itself as something almost essential or fundamental to human experience, and thereby a path as opposed to a pure repetition. And so as a storyteller, and as philosophers who are repeating ourselves ad nauseum with regard to our own points of view on things, and admitting that these things, yes, are basically micro tropes in the case of philosophers or just cultural tropes in the case of storytelling, how do you nevertheless, in the case, I guess, of screenwriting and whatever, acknowledge that, yes, I'm just rehashing something. However, the rehashing is in and of itself an important remembering, or somehow this is moving along the rehash in some sense that is necessary and not just a money grab. Like there's something about this story that is pushing the trope along, or at least pushing humanity along the trope. Maybe the trope is static and this trope is a fundamental essential and we're just moving across it. But yeah, how do you have a sense that you're even doing anything worthwhile in that? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And it like really, really emphasizes this repetition and difference, and if it's worthwhile, basically, because I mean that's really what the whole show is about, honestly. But
you know what that reminds me of real quick?
Yeah,
is
yeah.
like I was just gonna say it reminds me of the eternal return, yeah, and maybe that, I mean, obviously for Nietzsche, the idea of repetition is that it's a pure repetition, but the challenge therein is to enjoy the or to live in such a way, or to repeat in such a way that you embrace the repetition. And I suppose if the trope is essential and it's non-fungible, then it's not that you live in such a way that you wouldn't mind repeating it. It's that it is what it is. And the only wiggle room we have is whether or not we're going to enjoy it. I don't know.
So how I understand trope is that it's very much in what I call the story dimension, insofar as it is something within the story that always signifies something about the repetition that gives rise to the story in the first place. So like a trope isn't actually the part of this, like what I call like the theme, which is like the repetition in the story that gives meaning and belonging to the story. But it's something, so like if I were to tell a story, if me and you were to tell the same story, and I have my way of telling the story because I'm me and you're you, the trope will still unfold differently because who's telling the story. So like if to address is it worthwhile, I think Daniel has a really good quote where he says, it's not about if you heard it, it's not about if it's been said, it's if you heard it. And I think that really applies here, in the sense that I can tell the same story as Martin Scorsese. We can operating under the same theme, but my orientation to the theme is fundamentally different than Martin Scorsese's. And because of that, you haven't heard my orientation. And that's why it's worthwhile, because you can't actually know everything. You can't actually heard everything, because everybody has their own orientation to this repetition that gives rise to a path. So a good storyteller or a philosopher, like a philosopher, will talk about being insofar as you might already know what the philosopher is talking about, but the way in which he accesses being might be a way for you to access being differently, that might actually give you a different way of saying the same thing that you already knew, which allows you to like keep going. That difference in access point makes you feel this mystery more, and because you feel this mystery more, you kind of want to keep chasing after it. It's still the chase. It's always the chase.
I think always the chase is a really good point, and it also points to the creator themselves. Like when I think about someone else consuming my music, I get very disheartened, because I'm like, why don't they just listen to the Kinks and the Beatles and fucking the Velvet Underground and all these things that I just think are way better. But like I have reasons. Did I lose you guys?
No, I'm right here.
But I have reasons to make it anyway. but they're actually, to be honest, they're selfish reasons. They're reasons like, when I make music, the best is when I have to make the music. Like, it's for me, like I'm going through something cathartic, and so I'm doing it for me. And so, so yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways,
I have a great example with your music, actually. So like your song Truth, for example, okay? When I hear it, for some reason, it reminds me of something that Quentin Tarantino would use. Like there's something, like if you've seen Django, like the way you have like that whistling, the way the song unfolds, it reminds me of something that could be in something Django-esque, Quentin Tarantino-esque. But because to me, there's other songs that have that type of whistle, that type of cadence, but it's not the same. You're talking, like in your song, you're talking about something deep. You're talking about something deep in a different way than other songs that remind me of the same, musicality as the song that you have. So
once in a while, you nail it. Once in a while, like that song is different, right? And I have that song, and then a sea of redundancy, just a fucking ocean of useless shit. That some people enjoy, but like, yeah, it's okay. It's not. It's cool. Like if you like strawberry better than vanilla, but like, but then you can once in a while, and that's the striving, right? Because once in a while, you'll be in this mood and a thing, and something like Truth will happen, and so maybe that's, I don't know, when you said striving, it really hit me as like, in some ways that's the selfish, like we're striving, and maybe as a listener and as a consumer, you
help
striving.
me be selfish. You help me be selfish. Like you help me be selfish in the sense that, oh, now that I hear Truth and I have this like, this data, this bank of information for me to say, wow, this reminds me of Django, but it's not really like that. Actually, as a storyteller, when I hear Truth, I actually think of a different story for it, but it's similar to Django in a certain sense. It's similar to the things that I've already absorbed, but the combination of these similarities together actually allows me to generate something completely different, that where hopefully when someone takes in what I generate from the inspiration of Truth and Django and whatever, they're able to say, you know what, this reminds me of Truth. This reminds me of Django and this other song. And then
you're
it
right.
makes
You're
them
right.
say,
Truth is tropey. Truth has that trope. It's a very, that whistle with the thing. It's a trope. So
I love tropes like that for
yeah.
movies
No,
and
you're right.
for making scenes. Like I love just going in the car and playing a song and then being with people and being like, what do you think? What scene do you think of when you're hearing the song? And what I like doing, like I gotta pull up my iPhone. I mean my Apple Music, but like I'll play similar songs back to back, and it'll be actually really funny how people can think of completely different scenes to the similar song, where you could easily argue you could just pick the same scene for all these songs in a way. It's so to me, I think it's just necessary. It's necessary for vitality sake almost. It's like if there wasn't Truth, then the odds of me being able to be selfish insofar as I can just generate my own story are less likely. Like because I wrote my whole, storytelling philosophy, blah blah blah, before I met Daniel. But once I met Daniel, and then he took a look at it, I'm talking to him, I talked to you on the net, I talked to other people. It just changed. It just changed. It's still the same philosophy, but like I remember you saying, a year ago, it's like, I don't like philosophy about meaning. I don't like that shit. And like that like hit me like boom. And I was like, oh my God, like I totally get it. I totally fucking get it. And because of that, there's been so many times in the net that I've like changed my own way of approaching my own philosophy, because people basically say things that say, you're actually an idiot, Andrew, you're wrong. Like maybe not, that mean, but that sentiment, like it's just, that's why I love the net. It's like my crack for my mind a little bit. But yeah, I'll pass it off to somebody else. I have a lot. I gotta process what I'm thinking a bit more.
I have to pick up my daughter, but I was just going to say bye and that this was really fun and again, and yeah, it's my crack too. So, let's share the pipe.
Yeah.
Maybe you should change the name, Daniel.
We're gonna call it the pipe. Pass it the pipe. Different things. That's freaking funny.
That's the pipe, man.
The pipe. You'd be like, oh yeah, different thing. Well, I will have to run it. Well, I think it's interesting because like there's something like when you hear a trope and you're between the whistle and all the other times you've heard the whistle, that's a between space, right? And you're like, what does this mean? It's like and here's the weird thing. If the whistle was the same, like an equal sign as the other whistle, then you'd be like, oh, that's a cheat, like that's a copy. It works because it's similar. This is the weird thing. Good philosophy, good storytelling has some ability to not be an equal sign, but to suggest, to be similar to, because similar means that the audience has to do work. I'm not giving it to you, but I'm suggesting that there's work you could do, and that will create the meaning. Like, I'm not going to tell you this is a meteor crater, but I'm going to really like put you in a place where you'll be like, this is like a meteor crater, or this, what was this? And the thing is for me, and then I'll have to go, but I'll give it to Mr. Luber as well for a few more minutes. It seems like the way I think about it is my job in writing is to make a path of suggestion that leads the audience to a place where they make a choice regarding a duck bunny. Now, like the Wittgenstein duck bunny, of two equally possible options, I've suggested them to the choice, and now they have to make the choice. And no matter how much information decays, no matter how much compression or meaning occurs, the choice is always there. The choice is always there, and the audience then cannot escape the choice, which, by the way, means I'm leading the audience to something terrifying, because choice is terrifying. Choice has stakes, and then they have to decide according to what theme or what is their grounds for choosing that's a bunny, not a duck. That's a crater for a meteor, but it's my job to suggest them to that place. And yeah, you brought up attack. I knew. I'm about ready to have a 9-hour conversation, but I have to go. But Mr. Luber, please.
I'll just say, and I just have honestly the ideation chapter on my mind right now a lot. So I definitely am speaking toward that. But it's the viewer is just the last to see the story. Like the storyteller is just the first to see the story, which entails that the story that is already there for the viewer and the storyteller to discover. It's just that the storyteller is the first to discover it. And that just means that there needs to be this mediation through the storyteller that affords the viewer to even be able to interrogate the story themselves, for them to see the story themselves. And that mediation process, that is the repetition of you knowing you're on the path. Like when you're a philosopher, it's a shame Ebert left, but when you're a philosopher and when you are talking about philosophy to somebody, they are starting to interrogate what you're saying, which means, it necessarily means that there is the type of repetition, the path repetition, where you are both on the same path, even if it's complete disagreements. It's even better if it's disagreeing, because then you're really both on the path. And that is what's necessary for further participation of the path, even for yourself, because I might be on the path today, but tomorrow I might not be. And that's the thing. You need that collective tension, that collective type of repetition where someone is able to interrogate, which is being part of that repetition. You need it for yourself in order for you to even be yourself in a certain sense. So that's why it might feel like these Zizek and all these people talk about, they're just repeating themselves, but they're repeating themselves not to get people really to understand what they're saying, but it's almost as if it's for themselves. It's like, I'm allowing myself to stay on the path by virtue of repeating myself. And that's the key. That's the key. It's like, my friends think I'm just crazy, always thinking about theme and philosophy and reading things, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, if I don't, then I won't be me. It's like, it's literally like, it's like that. It's like, you can even compare it to food. It's like, oh, someone eats a lot of Caesar salad. Why do you eat so much Caesar salad? Because I like Caesar salad. I have to keep eating the Caesar salad to know that I like the Caesar salad, to know, my orientation to the Caesar salad. So it's like totally necessary. And if you have, and I know you got to go, so I'll cap it here. But if you are not repeating yourself, then I argue you're losing yourself. If there isn't that type of thematic repetition, then you're probably at a turning point where there's a new limit threshold that you're encountering, where a different type of repetition is looming potentially. But like, you can't escape this notion of repetition, because the second you aren't in that type of thematic repetition, you're in a liminal space, entering a new threshold, which would be a new type of thematic repetition, or rather more you just having a different orientation to this thematic repetition. So yeah, damn, I wish I came on earlier, but this was great.
You're a beautiful soul, Liv, and I'll give it to Tyler Murphy. There's a real sense in which disagreement is the guardrails. If there's never disagreement, then how do you know you're still on the path? You might go off and not know. And it's interesting because the repetition is guardrails. Like, okay, it's like you have to keep repeating, because you can't always have someone disagreeing, and you have to live with your own mental processes. So there's a way in which you're like, okay, am I still on the path? Am I still on the path? And like, one of the themes that we've been talking about is, what's interesting is to stay yourself, like to not lose yourself. Like, I like this idea that you're going to lose yourself if you don't repeat. What's interesting is that means you can only keep yourself by facing the fear of being repetitive. Like that, there's an act of facing a fear. Then it's like you keep yourself by facing the fear of being repetitive, and then not wanting to be boring, but also knowing you have to somehow be repetitive. And that's like the Deleuzian take on the eternal return, where you have to believe that the repetition always entails a difference somehow. Like, the repetition is never a pure repetition. There's always a creativity in there. But that's scary, because it sure does look the same. No, I'm going to face that fear and trust that there's actually something new here, something emerging, some sort of repetition that's actually sublative. I'm keeping myself. But it's interesting because, and then I'll give it to Tyler, there is a fear you have to face to keep yourself then, that is the fear of being repetitive. And that's precisely how you keep yourself. But it's interesting to think there's a courage in that. Luber, please.
Can I, real quick, I want to say that it's not just one fear. It's actually two fears. It's the fear of being wrong, or rather the fear of the disagreement, the guardrail. So when you rub up against the edge of the path that you're on, there's a fear. And then literally being in the center of the path walking, there's a fear. So that it's and like, I know you're well aware of the two, but like, it's funny when you're walking on the center of the path, naturally you start swaying a little bit, and naturally through the repetition of being on the center of the path, you bump up against the rail, and then it throws you back in the middle of that center. And it's a constant, like a bowling with the guardrails up. It's like, for you to hit the pins, if you're a shitty bowler like me, but if you hit the pins, then you are you did the path, you hit the guardrails, you did the thing. Sorry, Tyler.
No, I'm really glad you brought that up, because like, there is a fear. I'm in the path. If you never rub against guardrails, you start worrying that you're like brainwashed. And actually, one of the things people can do is pathologically then seek disagreement. But the problem is, it doesn't naturally emerge. It's like they directly turn toward the guardrail and run at it as hard they can. And then they go over the guardrail, actually, and they're deconstructed. You see that a lot, where people are like, oh my gosh, no one ever disagrees. What if I'm crazy? I better find someone who disagrees with me. And then they actually get deconstructed, actually, because they take on too much criticism before they're ready to handle it. And actually, they're like, well, that just proves I was wrong. No, it doesn't necessarily prove that you're wrong. It proves that you haven't been on the path long enough to know how to handle that level of intense scrutiny. That doesn't necessarily mean you were wrong or you weren't on a path. It might just mean that you're not ready to hit the guardrail at that speed, per se. So that is absolutely another fear that leads to people. You can't seek disagreement. You have to naturally bump up against it. But that's frightening, because what if I never do? Then I could be brainwashed and never. So there's all these fears. I think I'm really glad you brought that up. But let me give it to Tyler Murphy here. Mr. Murphy, please.
One of the other fears that I ran into recently, because I interviewed Jameson Webster this last week, was what if I interview this person whose books, I've learned so much from, and what if I am completely like misunderstanding her? What if it reveals, if in talking to her, it reveals how I'm just completely on some other path? That was kind of a freaky thing for me. But I don't know, speaking of repetition, Andrew, I think I've in some conversations sort of told you about some of the different, like as an artist, I keep repeating, coming back to the same sorts of scenes. Like here in Montana, there's a certain time of day that I keep painting again and again. Lately, anyways, I kind of paint all times of days over the course of my career as an artist. I have, but lately it's been evening and stuff. So anyways, I'm painting a scene with some little sledders and stuff. But these are, I don't know, oh my gosh, like 6 or 7 paintings here that are going to different places, but they're all like campfire scenes along a lake edge. And just like one of my friends, or my friends and I, we always talk about this needing to find certain motifs that we keep returning to again and again and again. And it's actually been with a lot of my friends, or especially 2 of them, no, actually all of them. But my friend Ken, he lives up near Glacier National Park, and he grew up hiking and just going on hikes there all the time. And now that he is zeroed in on, I'm going to be the painter of Glacier National Park, like his career has actually, I mean, like he can actually make a living as an artist now. But same with some of my other friends, my buddy Richie, he's got like 6 or 7 motifs that he just keeps coming back to again and again and again. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that in there.
First off, your paintings are stunning. Thank you for sharing them. And I think what you're saying about honoring a motif, there's something very interesting here as I come on the close, and alas, I will have to go. There's something about philosophy, art, story writing, speaking that honors an unfolding versus tries to be the thing unfolding. And that seems, obviously that's Heideggerian. I had to get my Heidegger quota in. And it's like because the media, like at the beginning, we were talking about the idea of the philosopher's job is to describe the creator of a meteor, not the meteor. And when you're describing the creator of the meteor, the philosopher is saying, I can never actually make fully present the meteor. And if I do it, it's going to dishonor it. And in fact, it's going to remove from the readers of my work the inspiration and incentive to go learn what a meteor is on their own, right? So what I'm going to do is honor an unfolding. But I have to keep returning to the creator to keep drawing it better and better and better. And so likewise, when you have a motif, it's almost like you're continuing, oh, that's a good look, like you're re-honoring the motif, re-honoring so it unfolds again and again. And you're like, oh, am I just being repetitive? No, that's actually the space of honoring the thing. You're letting it continually unfold in new and new ways. And then what you're doing in that is you're unveiling to the audience that reality is a thing that can continually unfold, which then changes how they experience life. Life is not then a thing of static objects. Life is a thing of unfolding situations. Oh, well, that's mysterious. You just said the key word. That's mysterious. Now you're left with a choice. Why is that mystery a constituting factor of reality? I've led you to a choice now. I didn't say in repeating the painting of the motif. I never said to you there was a mystery in reality. I never said there was a meteor. You just went, wow, Glacier National Park sure can unfold in a lot of different ways and look different ways, and certain pictures have a different aura than others and sit in the mirror. Why is that? It's all of the same national park. That's mysterious. Oh, okay, I didn't say that. I just drew the painting. I just painted. I just made the story. You're the one who then felt that there's a weird mystery going on. Now you choose what you're going to do with that. I, as the philosopher, I, as the painter, have led the audience now, led the viewer to a place where they make a choice. And I think that's our responsibility. You know, Ebert, if you're watching this on the question of what I try to do with thinkers, because he was asking like, oh, do you read like Simone Weil, Hume, or different people to become an expert on them, and you're trying to gather all the information and then you do your own work? There's all this kind of questions. It's a very good question. A way I think about it is I'm trying to say, I'll use David Hume since I do a lot of Hume. I'm trying to ultimately say something like this. This is kind of the formula in my head. Not that it's a formula. It's kind of like, if David Hume really said X, that would suggest Y. So what I'm trying to do is not just tell you what David Hume said. I'm trying to tell you what David Hume said that I really genuinely believe describes his thought to point towards something beyond David Hume. So this, you know, a Hume scholar is someone who doesn't try to use Hume to suggest, but to equal. Oh, if you read my book about Hume, you'll know David Hume, because my book is basically the equal sign between the philosophy of David Hume and David Hume. Well, I obviously think that my interpretation of David Hume is right. Otherwise, I wouldn't put it forth. But I'm not just trying to defend an interpretation. I'm trying to defend an interpretation to suggest something else. For example, it's like, if David Hume is correct, that philosophy separates you from custom because it is not able to ever ground itself in tradition, this would suggest that rationality eats itself. That when it's autonomous and doesn't refer to anything outside of itself, then it is self-destructive. If that is true, then what does that mean for economics in 2023? You see the move. I think this is Hume's argument, that autonomous rationality is auto-cannibalistic. Okay, if that's true, that has implications for how we tell stories, how we do economics, how we do friendships. Oh, wait a minute. What if conspiracies are actually examples of rationality that is autonomous? So what have we done? We've tried to argue what David Hume said to suggest something about now. So it's pointing beyond itself. It's moving you to a between space. I'm now between my reading of Hume and the 2023 economy or QAnon or whatever, right? So I've moved you into a between space. So to me, that is what philosophy really should do, is move like if David Hume really has successfully argued that rationality that is autonomous eats itself, you have a choice, Daniel L. Garner. You have a choice, viewer. You must change your life. I didn't tell you how to change your life. I didn't tell you that you're necessarily making this mistake. I didn't tell you how to live, but I have suggested to you that you must now make a choice on if you yourself make that mistake or not, and then what the implications of it would be, right? So this is where, for me, it's the between space, where I'm not telling you what you should do. But I am suggesting to you that if David Hume is right about that, it has implications now that you then have to make a choice about. You didn't ask, I've kind of like forced you. I've slammed the door behind you and forced you to make a choice. But, I have forced you to see the meteor crater. I have forced you to see the duck bunny. But I didn't tell you if it was a duck. I didn't tell you it was a bunny. I didn't tell you, there was a meteor. You have to choose. But I've led you to the place where there now is a choice. Or you can just try to pretend like you didn't read anything and go about your day, and that's a choice too, right? So this is what I think the artist, the philosopher, this is what we need to think about doing. And for me, a way I think about it, it's not my job to prove something. It's my job to suggest, ultimately to point. It's my job to ultimately suggest. All I ever can prove is a path. I prove a path. Basically, I prove a way, Like I've like, and by prove, it basically just means create. I've created a path. Like, here's the book, okay? But it's ultimately in service of a suggestion. And the way I think about it, the last thing I'll say is Schopenhauer's great line is he says, most people today read books to collect rungs on a ladder, to fill a bag so they can show their friends, hey, look at this rung of a ladder I have, as opposed to using the ladder to climb toward the sun, to climb toward truth and different things like that. Your job is to not give your readers things they can collect in a bag. Your job is to give them rungs of a ladder that they can climb towards something that you have suggested, because in giving them the ladder, you have suggested there's somewhere they can climb to. Now, it's up to them to choose if they're going to climb or not, but that's not your job. Your job is to simply present them with a ladder and give them reason not to collect the rungs of the ladder, but to instead climb them. Your job is to make them believe that there is something here that could bore them, as opposed to something that they should bear around to show to their friends. That is the act of inspiration. That is what is possible with a powerful suggestion. And that requires, though, having faith in them to engage in that climb. And if you don't have that faith, you're going to force them. And then all they're going to do is carry your ladder around as opposed to climb it. And I think that is the work of honoring and unfolding, honoring something that's there to suggest this ladder is not just something I have arbitrarily created. It's part of the world itself. So it's up to you to choose what you're going to do with what the world has unfolded before you. With that, I will run. Thank you, friends. I've enjoyed it very much. It is always a pleasure. Tyler, you're great. Andrew Luber, you're great. I love you both. Y'all have a wonderful day. All the best.